tiny feathers in the morning light, fluttering softly, taking flight. Buzzing hums in the meadow's breeze, a symphony among the trees. Little wings of wonder in the air, dancing freely without a care. From the skies to the forest floor, nature's beauty forevermore.
Little Wings of Wonder, Episode 9. Conservation and Challenges. The Fragile Future of Flying Jewels. Brought to you by the 1940s romance murder mystery novel Underlying Love, a Worthington, Ohio mystery, and by the Little Wings of Wonder book series. Both available at major book retailers. Hummingbirds face an uncertain future in a rapidly changing world where their specialized requirements collide with unprecedented environmental pressures. These remarkable birds, which have survived millions of years of natural challenges, now confront threats of unprecedented scope and speed that test the limits of their evolutionary adaptability. From habitat destruction in tropical wintering grounds to climate-induced mismatches between flower timing and migration schedules, hummingbirds must navigate an increasingly hostile landscape where traditional survival strategies may no longer suffice. The conservation status of hummingbird species reveals a sobering reality. Approximately 28 species currently face extinction risk, representing nearly 8% of all hummingbird species worldwide. This proportion places hummingbirds among the more threatened bird groups globally, with their specialized ecological requirements, making them particularly vulnerable to environmental changes that generalist species might weather more successfully. The challenges facing hummingbirds operate across multiple scales, from local habitat degradation to global climate change, creating complex conservation scenarios that require coordinated responses, spanning international boundaries and involving diverse stakeholders. Understanding these challenges provides the foundation for developing effective conservation strategies that can preserve these remarkable birds for future generations while maintaining the ecological relationships that have sustained them for millions of years. Perhaps most encouragingly, hummingbird conservation offers numerous opportunities for individual action and community involvement that can make meaningful differences in local and regional populations. The accessibility of hummingbirds to backyard observers, combined with their dependence on resources that individuals and communities can provide, creates unique opportunities for grassroots conservation efforts that complement larger-scale habitat protection initiatives. The global crisis. Species at risk. Understanding endangerment categories. The classification of hummingbird species according to extinction risk follows internationally recognized criteria that assess population trends, range sizes, and specific threats to determine conservation priorities. The International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN Red List categories, provide standardized frameworks for evaluating species status, though many hummingbird species remain poorly studied due to their remote habitats and specialized requirements. Critically endangered species face imminent extinction risk within decades if current trends continue, often due to extremely small populations, rapid population declines, or severely restricted ranges that make them vulnerable to catastrophic events. These species require immediate intensive management to prevent extinction, though the specialized nature of hummingbird ecology often makes effective intervention challenging. Endangered species show clear evidence of population decline or range restriction that threatens their survival within the foreseeable future, though they retain slightly better prospects for recovery than critically endangered species. Many endangered hummingbirds inhabit isolated mountain ranges or islands where habitat protection and restoration efforts can make significant differences in their conservation prospects. Vulnerable species show concerning population trends or face significant threats that could lead to endangerment if not addressed, representing the categories where proactive conservation efforts can be most effective in preventing further decline. These species often serve as indicators of ecosystem health while retaining sufficient population sizes to respond positively to conservation interventions. Data-deficient species lack sufficient information for accurate status assessment, though this category often masks species that may be threatened but remain unstudied due to their inaccessible habitats or recent scientific recognition. Improving knowledge of these species represents a critical conservation priority that can reveal hidden threats while identifying new conservation opportunities. Regional patterns of endangerment. Tropical mountain regions harbor the highest concentrations of endangered hummingbird species, reflecting both the exceptional diversity of these areas and their vulnerability to climate change and habitat destruction. The cloud forests and high-elevation ecosystems that support many endemic hummingbird species face particular pressure from temperature increases that push suitable habitat to higher elevations, where land area becomes increasingly limited. Island populations face unique conservation challenges due to their isolation and limited genetic diversity, making them particularly vulnerable to disease outbreaks, invasive species, and climate change impacts. Several Caribbean hummingbird species exemplify these challenges, with populations restricted to single islands where habitat loss or severe weather events could trigger rapid population crashes. Andean regions support exceptional hummingbird diversity while facing intense pressure from human development, mining activities, and climate change that alters the elevation zones where different species can survive. The narrow altitudinal ranges of many Andean hummingbirds make them particularly vulnerable to temperature increases that force species to track suitable climate conditions to higher elevations. Central American highlands represent critical conservation priorities due to their role as both breeding areas for resident species and migration corridors for North American species. Habitat destruction in these regions affects not only endemic species, but also the millions of migratory hummingbirds that depend on these areas for stopover resources during their epic journeys. Brazilian Atlantic forest fragments support numerous endemic hummingbird species while facing continued pressure from urbanization and agricultural expansion. The highly fragmented nature of remaining Atlantic forest makes it difficult for hummingbird populations to maintain genetic connectivity, while limiting their ability to respond to environmental changes through range shifts. Specific threats to endangered species. Habitat destruction represents the primary threat to most endangered hummingbird species, with deforestation rates in tropical regions continuing to outpace conservation efforts despite increased awareness of biodiversity values. The specialized habitat requirements of many hummingbird species make them particularly vulnerable to forest fragmentation that may leave apparently suitable habitat patches too small or isolated to support viable populations. climate change creates novel threats that may be particularly challenging for hummingbird conservation due to the complex relationships between temperature, precipitation, and the flowering patterns that support hummingbird populations. Species adapted to narrow temperature ranges face particular challenges as climate zones shift more rapidly than forests can migrate, potentially creating mismatches between bird requirements and available habitat. Invasive species alter ecosystem dynamics in ways that can dramatically affect hummingbird populations, from introduced plants that lack the nectar quality of native species to predatory animals that increase mortality rates. On islands, invasive species often create particularly severe impacts due to the lack of evolutionary experience with novel threats among native species. Disease outbreaks can devastate small hummingbird populations, particularly when combined with other stressors that reduce population resilience. The concentration of birds at artificial feeding stations can facilitate disease transmission, while creating dependencies that may increase vulnerability during disease outbreaks. Human disturbance affects hummingbird populations through direct impacts, such as window strikes and vehicle collisions, as well as indirect effects, such as light pollution that disrupts migration timing, and artificial noise that interferes with communication. The cumulative impacts of multiple disturbance sources can create significant stress on populations, even when individual impacts appear minor. Climate change disrupting ancient patterns, shifting migration timing and phenology. Climate change is fundamentally altering the environmental cues that have guided hummingbird migration for millions of years, creating mismatches between bird movements and the resource availability that supports successful breeding and survival. These phenological disruptions represent some of the most insidious climate change impacts, as they may cause population declines even in areas where habitat remains intact. Spring advancement across North America has accelerated dramatically in recent decades, with many plant species blooming 1 to 3 weeks earlier than historical norms. While some hummingbird populations have adjusted their migration timing to track these changes, others maintain traditional schedules that may no longer coincide with peak flower availability in their breeding areas. The complexity of climate change impacts becomes evident when considering that different plant species respond differently to temperature and precipitation changes, potentially altering the sequence of flower availability that hummingbirds have relied upon for efficient territory establishment and breeding success. Early blooming species may advance their flowering more than late blooming species, compressing the overall flowering season while reducing the diversity of nectar sources available throughout the breeding period. Fall migration timing faces different challenges, as birds must balance the need to depart before deteriorating weather conditions against the benefits of remaining longer to take advantage of late-season flower resources. Climate change may extend favorable weather periods while simultaneously reducing late-season flower availability, creating complex trade-offs that individual birds must navigate without evolutionary experience. Weather pattern changes during migration periods can create additional challenges, as birds encounter unfamiliar storm systems, altered wind patterns, or extreme weather events that exceed their physiological tolerances. The increasing frequency and intensity of severe weather events associated with climate change may cause direct mortality, while depleting energy reserves needed for successful migration completion. Range shifts and habitat tracking. As climate zones shift poleward and upward in elevation, hummingbird species must track suitable conditions through range shifts that may exceed their dispersal capabilities or encounter barriers that prevent successful colonization of newly suitable areas. The rate of climate change may exceed the ability of both birds and their food plants to respond, creating temporal lags that could result in population declines, even as suitable habitat theoretically becomes available elsewhere. Altitudinal range shifts represent particular challenges for mountain-dwelling species that may face shrinking habitat areas as suitable climate zones move to higher elevations where less land is available. Species currently occupying high elevation areas may face complete habitat loss as suitable climate zones shift beyond available mountaintop habitat. Tracking suitable climate conditions requires not only the ability to reach new areas, but also the presence of appropriate food plants, nesting sites, and other habitat components necessary for successful breeding. The complex ecological relationships that support hummingbird populations may not shift as coordinated units, potentially creating areas with suitable climate but inadequate ecological support systems. Barriers to range expansion include human-dominated landscapes that lack suitable habitat for dispersing birds, mountain ranges that create geographic obstacles to movement, and water bodies that represent insurmountable barriers for species with limited overwater flight capabilities. Urban and agricultural areas may be particularly problematic, as they often lack the native plant communities that provide appropriate nectar sources for traveling birds. Competition with existing species in newly suitable areas may prevent successful establishment, even when dispersing birds reach appropriate habitat. Established species may exclude newcomers from the best territories, while resource competition could prevent both residents and immigrants from achieving breeding success in areas where carrying capacity becomes exceeded. Extreme weather and population impacts. The increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events associated with climate change pose direct threats to hummingbird populations through mortality during events and indirect effects that reduce breeding success and survival rates. These impacts may be particularly severe for species with restricted ranges or small population sizes that cannot absorb significant mortality without triggering population declines. Severe storms during migration periods can cause catastrophic mortality when birds encounter conditions that exceed their flight capabilities or energy reserves. Hurricanes and tropical storms can devastate migrating populations while destroying habitat in both breeding and wintering areas, creating impacts that persist for multiple years as damaged ecosystems recover. Drought conditions reduce flower production and nectar quality, while concentrating birds at fewer remaining resources where competition intensifies and disease transmission risks increase. Extended droughts may force birds to abandon territories or attempt longer movements to reach adequate resources, increasing energy expenditure and mortality risks. Extreme heat events can exceed the thermoregulatory capabilities of hummingbirds, particularly when combined with reduced water availability and stressed plant communities that produce less nectar. Urban heat islands may create particularly challenging conditions where temperatures exceed those in surrounding natural areas. Unusual cold snaps can cause direct mortality when they occur during migration periods or in areas where hummingbirds normally experience mild winter conditions. These events may also trigger emergency energy conservation behaviors such as extended torpor that reduce feeding opportunities and increase vulnerability subject to predation. Flooding and severe precipitation events can destroy nests and reduce insect availability, while making flying dangerous or impossible during critical feeding periods. The timing of extreme precipitation events relative to breeding cycles can determine whether populations experience minor inconvenience or significant reproductive failure. Conservation strategies and success stories. Protected area management. Effective hummingbird conservation requires protected area networks that encompass the full range of habitats and elevations that species need throughout their annual cycles. This landscape-scale approach becomes particularly important for migratory species that may require protected stopover sites spanning thousands of miles along their migration routes. Critical habitat identification helps prioritize conservation efforts. By focusing on areas that support disproportionately large numbers of individuals or serve essential functions in species' life cycles. For hummingbirds, critical habitats often include migration bottlenecks, high-elevation breeding areas, and tropical forest fragments that support exceptional diversity. Corridor development connects isolated habitat patches through strategic protection and restoration efforts that allow genetic exchange between populations while providing movement pathways for species responding to climate change. Effective corridors for hummingbirds must include appropriate nectar sources and nesting sites at intervals that match species' daily movement capabilities. Adaptive management approaches acknowledge uncertainty in conservation planning while establishing monitoring systems that can detect changes in species' responses to management actions. This flexibility becomes particularly important for hummingbird conservation given the rapid pace of environmental change and the specialized nature of species requirements. International cooperation becomes essential for protecting migratory species that cross multiple national boundaries during their annual cycles. Successful programs coordinate conservation efforts across countries while addressing the different economic and political challenges that affect conservation implementation in different regions. Habitat restoration and enhancement. Restoration of degraded habitats can dramatically improve conservation prospects for hummingbird species when projects focus on reestablishing the plant communities and ecological processes that support native bird populations. Successful restoration requires understanding both the historical composition of target areas and the current factors that may limit restoration success. Native plant restoration provides the foundation for effective hummingbird habitat enhancement, with projects focusing on species that provide nectar sources throughout the flowering season, while supporting the insect communities that supply essential protein for breeding birds. Plant selection must consider not only current conditions, but also projected climate changes that may affect species survival and performance. Forest restoration in tropical areas can benefit multiple hummingbird species simultaneously, while providing ecosystem services that support human communities. These projects often require long-term commitments, as forest recovery may take decades, though interim benefits can be achieved through strategic planting of fast-growing nectar sources. Agricultural landscape enhancement through pollinator strips, hedgerows, and farm woodland establishment can create significant habitat improvements while providing economic benefits to landowners. These approaches may be particularly valuable in creating habitat connectivity across human-dominated landscapes where traditional protected areas are insufficient. Urban habitat creation demonstrates that meaningful hummingbird conservation can occur even in highly modified environments when appropriate plant selections and design principles are employed. Cities and suburbs can support significant hummingbird populations while providing conservation education opportunities that build support for broader conservation efforts. Research and monitoring programs. Long-term monitoring programs provide essential data for understanding population trends, identifying conservation priorities, and evaluating the effectiveness of management actions. Hummingbird monitoring faces unique challenges due to species' small size, rapid movements, and often remote habitats, requiring specialized techniques and substantial volunteer involvement. Banding programs generate critical data on survival rates, site fidelity, and movement patterns that inform conservation planning, while providing opportunities for detailed studies of individual birds throughout their lifespans. Modern marking techniques using tiny radio transmitters and GPS loggers are revolutionizing understanding of hummingbird movements and habitat use patterns. Citizen science initiatives harness the enthusiasm of thousands of volunteers to collect data on hummingbird distributions, abundance, and timing that would be impossible for professional researchers to gather alone. Programs like eBird and Journey North provide platforms for data collection while engaging participants in meaningful conservation activities. Genetic research reveals population structure, migration connectivity, and evolutionary relationships that inform conservation strategies while identifying populations that may require special protection due to their unique genetic heritage. DNA analysis can also detect hybridization events and assess the genetic health of small populations. Climate change research focuses on understanding how species are responding to changing environmental conditions while developing models that predict future distribution changes and conservation needs. This research becomes increasingly important as conservation planning must anticipate future conditions rather than simply protecting current distributions. Individual actions for conservation. Creating backyard habitat. Individual property owners can make meaningful contributions to hummingbird conservation through thoughtful landscape design that provides nectar sources, nesting sites, and insect habitat throughout the growing season. The cumulative impact of thousands of wildlife-friendly yards can create significant habitat networks that support substantial bird populations. Native plant gardening provides the most effective approach for supporting local hummingbird populations, while requiring minimal maintenance once established. Native plants have evolved with local pollinators and provide superior nectar quality compared to exotic alternatives, while supporting the insect communities that supply essential protein for breeding birds. Seasonal bloom succession ensures nectar availability throughout the period when hummingbirds are present, requiring plant selections that flower from early spring through late fall in areas with resident populations, or throughout the migration and breeding periods in areas with seasonal populations. Water feature installation provides essential resources that complement nectar sources, while creating focal points for observation and photography. Moving water sources such as drippers or fountains are particularly attractive to hummingbirds, while preventing mosquito breeding in standing water. Pesticide elimination protects both hummingbirds and their insect prey, while reducing chemical contamination that can accumulate in bird tissues and affect reproduction. Organic gardening approaches that encourage beneficial insects provide superior long-term solutions for pest management while supporting healthy ecosystems. Feeder maintenance programs can supplement natural resources while providing close viewing opportunities, though they require consistent effort to ensure nectar quality and prevent disease transmission. Properly maintained feeders can support significant numbers of birds while creating educational opportunities that build conservation awareness. Community-level initiatives. Neighborhood habitat corridors can be created through coordinated efforts among adjacent property owners to establish continuous habitat strips that support movement and genetic exchange between local populations. These initiatives often begin with individual efforts that inspire neighbors to participate in expanding projects. School and institutional gardens provide opportunities for education while creating significant habitat areas that can support substantial bird populations. These projects often generate community enthusiasm while teaching conservation principles to young people who will become future conservation leaders. Municipal pollinator programs can establish hummingbird habitat in parks, greenways, and other public spaces while demonstrating conservation principles that encourage private property owners to implement similar practices. These programs often receive strong public support due to the charismatic nature of hummingbirds and other pollinators. Community science programs engage volunteers in data collection efforts that contribute to scientific understanding while building conservation awareness and skills among participants. Local Audubon chapters and native plant societies often coordinate these efforts while providing training and equipment for participants. Conservation organizations' support through membership, volunteering, and financial contributions helps fund professional conservation efforts, while demonstrating public support for habitat protection and restoration initiatives. Many organizations offer specific programs focused on hummingbird conservation that provide direct opportunities for involvement. Policy and advocacy support. Political engagement at local, state, and federal levels helps ensure that conservation receives appropriate priority in government decisions that affect habitat protection and species management. Voting for candidates who support environmental protection and contacting elected officials about specific conservation issues can influence policy decisions. Land use planning participation allows citizens to influence development decisions that affect local habitat while advocating for green infrastructure that provides wildlife benefits. Planning Commission meetings and public hearings provide opportunities for conservation advocacy that can affect large areas. Corporate responsibility advocacy encourages businesses to adopt practices that support conservation while recognizing companies that demonstrate environmental leadership. Consumer choices that support environmentally responsible companies can create market incentives for conservation-friendly practices. Educational outreach through presentations, social media, and informal conversations helps build public awareness and support for conservation while inspiring others to take action. Personal conservation efforts often serve as powerful examples that motivate broader community involvement. Creating habitat corridors in neighborhoods. Planning and design principles. Effective habitat corridor design requires understanding the movement patterns and habitat needs of target species while working within the constraints of existing development patterns and property ownership. Successful corridors provide continuous habitat connections that allow daily movement between resources and seasonal movement for dispersal and migration. Corridor width determines the effectiveness of habitat connections, with wider corridors supporting more species and providing better protection from edge effects that can degrade habitat quality. Even narrow corridors can provide valuable movement pathways when they include appropriate plant selections and minimize disturbance. Connectivity mapping helps identify existing habitat patches and potential corridor routes, while highlighting barriers that must be addressed through restoration or management actions. Geographic information systems and aerial photography can reveal corridor opportunities that may not be apparent from ground-level observation. Plant selection for corridors must consider the specific needs of target species while adapting to local growing conditions and maintenance capabilities. Native plants that provide nectar sources throughout the growing season, while supporting insect communities, create the most effective corridor habitat. Maintenance planning ensures long-term corridor success by addressing ongoing needs for plant care, invasive species control, and habitat management. Sustainable corridor design minimizes maintenance requirements while building community support through volunteer involvement opportunities. Implementation strategies. Phased development allows corridor projects to proceed incrementally as funding and property access become available, while demonstrating success that builds support for expansion efforts. Starting with willing participants and high visibility locations can generate momentum for larger projects. Partnership building brings together diverse stakeholders, including property owners, conservation organizations, government agencies, and community groups to share resources and expertise while distributing project responsibilities. Successful partnerships often begin with informal conversations that evolve into formal collaboration agreements. Funding strategies may include grants from conservation organizations, government programs, corporate sponsorships, and community fundraising efforts that spread costs while building broad support for projects. Many funding sources prioritize projects that demonstrate community involvement and long-term sustainability. Volunteer coordination helps manage the substantial labor requirements of corridor establishment while building community ownership and conservation skills among participants. Training programs and organized work events can accomplish significant habitat improvements while creating social connections among conservation-minded neighbors. Monitoring and evaluation systems track corridor effectiveness while identifying needed improvements and demonstrating success to supporters and potential funders. Simple monitoring protocols that engage volunteers can provide valuable data while maintaining community involvement in ongoing project success. Measuring success and adaptation. Species monitoring provides the most direct measure of corridor effectiveness through regular surveys that document bird use patterns and population trends over time. Standardized survey protocols allow comparison between sites and years while building data sets that can guide adaptive management decisions. Habitat quality assessment evaluates the ecological functions that corridors provide while identifying areas where improvements may be needed. Metrics such as plant survival, flower production, and insect abundance provide indicators of corridor health that can guide management actions. Community engagement evaluation measures the social success of corridor projects through participation rates, volunteer retention, and expansion of conservation activities to adjacent areas. Strong community support often determines long-term project success more than ecological factors alone. Adaptive management allows corridor projects to evolve based on monitoring results and changing conditions while maintaining focus on conservation objectives. Regular evaluation and adjustment of management practices help ensure that corridors continue providing effective habitat as environmental conditions change. The conservation of hummingbirds requires coordinated efforts spanning individual actions to international initiatives, each playing essential roles in addressing the complex challenges facing these remarkable birds. While the threats are serious and growing, the accessibility of hummingbirds to individual observers and their responsiveness to habitat improvements provide numerous opportunities for meaningful conservation action. The future of hummingbirds depends not only on protecting their tropical habitats and addressing climate change, but also on the collective actions of thousands of individuals who create habitat, support conservation organizations, and advocate for policies that prioritize wildlife protection. Through understanding both the challenges and opportunities facing hummingbirds, we can each contribute to ensuring that future generations will continue to marvel at these flying jewels that bring such beauty and wonder to our world. If you liked what you heard today, consider purchasing other books by Bradley Barkhurst, including Underlying Love, a Worthington, Ohio mystery. It's 1941 in the quaint village of Worthington, Ohio. Life is changing at the end of the Great Depression. Elizabeth Russo, 23, teaches elementary school but feels uncertain about her future. Her Sicilian immigrant father ran the Red and White, a popular village general store. 5 years prior, Elizabeth's high school sweetheart, Samuel, left the village abruptly, leaving her with unanswered questions. Now engaged to George, the Red and White's accountant, Elizabeth still can't forget Samuel. When her father tragically passes away and her mother goes to Cincinnati to help her ailing Aunt Gracie, Elizabeth is forced to be alone. Then one night, Elizabeth receives a phone call from her mother, asking her to come to Cincinnati to see her ailing aunt. Before leaving, and without notice, Samuel, Elizabeth's high school sweetheart, unexpectedly shows up in the village. Upon Elizabeth's return from Cincinnati, she hears a scream and sees a figure fleeing. The village banker, Mr. Collins, is found murdered, with suspicion falling on a local hobo. Elizabeth and her quirky neighbor, Betty Wimsfeld, investigate the murder. As they uncover village secrets, Elizabeth struggles with her feelings for George and Samuel. Will Elizabeth solve the murder mystery? Will she choose her stable engagement, or risk rekindling an old flame? Find out in Underlying Love, a Worthington, Ohio mystery, available through major book retailers and underlyinglove.com. Stay tuned for the last episode of Little Winged Wonders inside the fascinating world of hummingbirds, your year-round hummingbird guide.